This next session is a real treat. Only 2 individuals have ever held the position of U.S. Chief of Space Operations. General J. Raymond, the first Chief of Space Operations, and General Chance Saltzman, current Chief of Space Operations. We are fortunate to have both here together today. Only these 2 gentlemen know fully the challenges of standing up a new service, the weight of all the decisions that must be made, navigating a large bureaucracy that sees a dollar going towards space as a dollar taken away from them. But they also have the unique privilege of creating something new, of setting the foundation, the ethos, and the direction of the Space Force for generations to come. General Saltzman plans to give some opening remarks, and then will then be joined on stage for a fireside chat with General Raymond. So please join me in welcoming General Chance Saltzman to the stage.
Well, good morning. It's an incredible opportunity at this time of year to celebrate the 5th anniversary, 5th birthday of the Space Force and sing the praises of the Space Force. But looking at this speaker list, this is kind of like the Space Force Illuminati, responsible for standing up, shaping the early years. It's the shoulders, those are the giants that that have the shoulders that we're standing on today. So I'm really thankful for this opportunity. I do like to say that we're still building the foundations and we're putting them in place. But these distinguished speakers that have gone before you are really the cornerstone bricks of that foundation. So I'm grateful to all their help and support. Of course, I have to also thank CSIS for pulling this event together. And forums like this are invaluable to the United States Space Force to ensure we have a continuous dialogue with key stakeholders and advocates. If you take a break from tracking the Space Force for even a few weeks, we evolve quickly away from your basic understanding. So thank you very much for keeping the Space Force in the collective consciousness of our national security brain trust. And I think we're going to have a great conversation today, Jay. So thanks to General Raymond, of course, for being here today and setting us on the right path. You'll have big shoes to fill. Very big shoes, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about where we've gone since we've handed off the baton. And thanks to the folks in the audience who operate in space, advocate for it, or just care about the domain. Every day, space becomes just a little bit more important to the American way of life. And there's a small but growing number of us committed to ensuring that it remains safe, stable, and sustainable. Since this is a Space Force birthday celebration, though, I'd like to set the stage by reflecting on all the things that we've accomplished since the 20th of December, 2019. And I've said it before, I'll say it again. I cannot overstate how proud I am of the hard work our nation's guardians have done to stand up an entirely new branch of service. This is really underappreciated in modern times. The Space Force is the first new American military service in 72 years. A lot of the processes and policies required to make that happen were long forgotten by the time that we needed them. And it was far more than just moving people and resources from one org chart to another. We had to transform a support element into a full-up, no-kidding warfighting service. And we had to do all of that originally in mostly a cost-neutral way. We had a handful of dedicated people on staff and no relief from the no-fail missions we had to maintain. And let's not forget pesky COVID-19 pandemic that made life so interesting almost immediately after our establishment. But those character-building years, that's how I'm calling them, Jay, those character-building years have been well worth the effort. From those humble beginnings, we have laid the foundations of a space service that is dedicated and laser-focused on achieving space superiority, a service that is unparalleled in its talent and capabilities in the domain, a service that every day is increasing our readiness to secure our nation's interests in, from, and to space. And above all, we have finally have an organization that can apply a service-level focus to contesting and controlling the space domain, a domain that has never been more vital to our national security and to our national prosperity. And that focus underscores many of our most significant achievements to date. Although still not where we need it, our budget has increased substantially with a number of mission aggregations and some new investments since activation. On average, we have tripled in size every year for the last 5 years in personnel, an astounding growth rate for any government organization. We have reimagined operations, redefined policies, reworked processes from the ground up to forge a service purpose-built for great power competition. All of this in just 5 years. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, never have so few accomplished so much in such a short period of time. And along the way, we've had to challenge our assumptions about everything from budget to policy to talent management and so much more. If you need convincing, just consider any one of the institutional accomplishments we've seen as a result of our efforts. We defined and implemented a force generation model unique to Space Forces into our largely employed-in-place missions. We overhauled force design and are actively in the process of establishing Space Futures Command as its responsible headquarters. We stood up service components for 3 critical combatant commands, geographic combatant commands, with more coming right behind it. We redesigned our PME and officer training programs, and we're working to do the same to build space-minded enlisted warfighters. With the help of Congress, we won the authority to create a part-time workforce inside our single active component. This unprecedented approach will be crucial for retaining talent, improving quality of life in a way never before seen in the Department of Defense. Or how about our operational accomplishments? We proved the operational relevance of proliferated missile warning and data transport architectures. We supported increases in the space launch tempo of nearly 500%, and we've demonstrated the viability of tactically responsive space. We shared space situational awareness data with 34 foreign nations and hundreds of commercial and academic partners. We provided continuous position, navigation, and timing to hundreds of millions of GPS users. We've connected over 100,000 active SATCOM users. We've deployed electronic warfare capabilities to 10 nations for a collective 2,551 days. In 2024 alone, we supported 45 exercises, tracked 226 successful space launches. We cataloged 3,345 space objects and reported 1,166 conjunction notifications on the ISS and the Chinese space station. I'm getting kind of tired just saying all those numbers. My point here is that we've done a lot, and it's not always easy to see. And I know there are some out there who would say we should do more or we should do less of something. But I say that we have shouldered an incredible responsibility and proven ourselves more than equal to it. We have created something new while preserving the best of what came before. In the course of doing so, I think we learned a lot, both about our work and about ourselves. Last week at the Space Power Conference, I shared what I consider to be 6 truths about the Space Force, 6 foundational service principles that I believe form the core of what it means to be a Guardian. And if you want to understand what the Space Force is and why it matters, then look no further than these 6 truths. First and foremost, Space Force capabilities are critical to the joint force and the American way of life. They underpin both our national security and our prosperity. Therefore, the second truth states that it is our responsibility to defend our space capabilities. Space is the backbone of the joint force. Without it, we cannot project military power. Unfortunately, we're not the only nation that's recognized the strategic value of space superiority. Adversaries have aggressively developed and fielded counter-space threats. So our third truth states that the U.S. Space Force must protect the joint and combined force from space-enabled attack. The fourth truth is intended to stop any debate and declare that space is a warfighting domain. Therefore, the Space Force cannot simply be a support element. It is our job to contest and control the domain through the application of military force. Which brings us to the fifth truth. It defines our role in the domain. And whilst we know that the Space Force is responsible for organizing, training, and equipping critical space capabilities, we assert that the Space Force is also responsible for conducting warfighting operations as an integral part of the joint force. Finally, and unapologetically, we state as our sixth and final truth that Guardians are uniquely and specifically trained, educated, and experienced for warfighting in, from, and to the space domain. No one else is better suited to lead a campaign in space. No one else has the tools required to achieve space superiority. These truths embody who we are, and they lay the groundwork for all who are to follow. But what is to come precisely? I've spoken a lot about foundations, so the natural reaction is to ask what structures we intend to place on these foundations. Well, let me stake out some priorities that I have for 2025. Resources are going to dictate how far we can get over, how much we can get accomplished in the next 12 months, but this is where the service is headed. We're going to finish the implementation of the Space Force Personnel Management Act. We're going to accelerate proliferated warfighting space architecture to operations. We're going to further expand the launch support tempo and its capacity in the infrastructure. We're going to stand up Futures Command and publish an objective force for 2025. We're going to finish the establishment of our service components to the combatant commands. We have plans to deploy the next generation of mission control capabilities to relieve stress on the satellite control network. Personally, I intend to employ an advocacy blitz to increase our budget to field timely counter-space capabilities. And I'm going to operationalize the congressionally directed role that I have as the Department of Defense's Force Design Architect for Space. This may not be a comprehensive list of our projects, but it's a large list for a small service. But we're used to that by now. This is work that has to get done. It's critical to the future of the Joint Force and to the Space Force, critical to the lethality of the Joint Force, and critical to the safety and security of our nation. Today, against all odds, I'm proud to say, without question, the Space Force Guardians are the preeminent space warfighters, armed and ready to protect and defend the future of our nation. We have a lot of challenges and opportunities ahead of us, and we're going to need your help to get there. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. Happy birthday, Semper Supra.
Happy birthday. Thank you. Well, good morning. I think it's still morning. It is great to be here, and it's great to be at CSIS. I want to thank Carrie for pulling all this together. I also want to thank Dr. Hamry. Dr. Hamry was very helpful in the build-up to the Space Force, and then clearly helped in the early establishment efforts of the service. I also need to start, as I always do, and thank Congressman Rogers, who's already left, and Congressman Cooper for their leadership in helping make the Space Force an independent service, which is absolutely critical to our national security. I will never forget the speech at the Space Symposium in 2017. I was sitting right there. It was almost surreal when Congressman Rogers was up here speaking, and I was about the same location as this morning that I was back in 2017. And I took his words to heart. He said, he described shortfalls in where he saw the national security space enterprise. People and professional development was number one, the first thing that he highlighted. Resources, he talked about resources being down 23% when he gave that speech in 2017, focused on space. He talked about the org chart and the kudzu chart that he calls it, and the 60 different organizations that everybody could say no, but nobody could say yes. He talked about the lack of integration, where you had satellites that were being launched and you didn't have terminals on the ground that could communicate with those satellites. And he talked about culture. And I will tell you, every day that I came to work, we focused on those imperatives that he had laid out. He talked about establishing clear lines of authority and responsibility, thinning out the kudzu. He talked about elevating space to be on par with the other domains of conflict, to include having a separate budget. He talked about further integrating the national security space enterprise. And as I looked at those shortfalls and recommendations, we took those to heart. And it's really hard to believe, as others have said, that it's been 5 years since President Trump signed the National Defense Authorization Act at a hangar at Andrews Air Force Base, and we established the new service. As I look back over the 5 years, I'm immensely proud of the Space Force Guardians, and I don't think anyone could argue that we were better postured 5 years ago for the challenges that we face in space than we are today. But I know General Saltzman would agree that there's a lot more work to do, and I can't think of a more capable and qualified leader to be the CSO than the gentleman sitting to my right. Happy birthday to you, happy birthday to the Guardians, and thank you for your leadership.
Thank you.
What I thought we would do is just talk about, have a little fireside chat on some of the key topics that were raised earlier, and then open it up for questions from the floor. I think it's important to start with what Congressman Rogers started with, and that's our Guardians. And there's two pieces, as he mentioned. There's a quantitative piece and a qualitative piece to our Guardians. Let's begin with the qualitative piece. As you highlighted, Guardians are the only warfighters that are educated, trained, and developed to achieve space superiority. And a lot has been done over the past 5 years to build to create the developmental programs needed to build these Guardians. Largely, the items that were highlighted by Congressman Rogers in his speech in 2017 have all been addressed. What is your focus on professional development of Guardians going forward in the future?
Well, I remember, early on, one of the things that we said is, we were asking these foundational questions about being the first new service in 72 years. And it's like, well, what is it a service does? And General Raymond used to have these talking points he would just rally off. And one of them was, well, you train your own people. You have to educate your own people. You can't rely on another service to do that. Obviously, with the bulk of our Guardians originally coming out of the Air Force, we were dependent heavily on an Air Force to do a lot of our training and education. And we've rapidly, I think, since it's only been 5 years, shifted away from that in a lot of key areas, like our professional military education, just down the street here at Johns Hopkins. That's a perfect example where we are focused on space training, space education. When Jay and I grew up, we went to other services, professional military education opportunities. And there was maybe a little space if we were lucky, but really you were learning about the other domains. That's no longer the case. We're educating Guardians on the space domain. We've revised our officer training course. When you come into the Space Force as an officer, you are going to an operational assignment. We believe our acquisition community will be better if they understand firsthand the operational environment before they go try to develop capabilities for it. Likewise, we're going to start to blur what it means to be a space operator. You're going to do time in a SPO. You're going to understand contract management. You're going to understand how to deliver capabilities so that you can perform in staffs and in some of the traditional things like writing requirements. And you'll have a better understanding because you've had those experiences. So we're trying to really think about the space domain and what skills and expertise it needs, and then work those into our training and education programs across the entire force.
Thanks. I think that's really important. That's one of the areas that Congressman Rogers talked about this morning, wanting to make sure that we're not just prioritizing operators, that we're prioritizing everybody. I think it's important to note that the Vice Chief of Space Operations is an acquisition officer. The individual that's leading the STAR Command, Space Training, Doctrine, Readiness, and Testing, is an acquisition professional. Right. So I think we've taken that to heart and appreciate your efforts. Now let's talk about the size. You talked about we've tripled, every year. I will tell you, in 3 months, we went up 86 times. It went from 1 to 88. We went from 1 to 88 when we brought in the first graduating class of the Air Force Academy in April of 2020. But it was really important back then that we didn't grow this big, huge bureaucracy, that we were mission focused, that we were moving at speed. I remember having an office call with a senator telling him that, hey, we're going to keep this light, lean, lethal. And he said, you better or we'll kill you. So I kind of took that to heart and said, okay, we're not going to grow big. So we actually cut the initial headquarters staff size from what it was initially planned to be. We cut the size of, like, the SPOC, the Field Command for Space Operations Command. We took that to heart. And where you are today, 16,000 is about where we landed with our initial planning efforts. Yeah. Now that you're into this, and now that you've got a couple years under your belt with those types of numbers, I'd ask you, do you think you have enough to do the integration in the joint force, the integration with the intelligence community, and to be able to populate the service that you need to be able to populate to be able to do what our nation needs us to do?
Yeah, I think the short answer is not quite. I think, plugging into the Department of Defense and the bureaucracy and what it takes to put a budget together, to work the policy, to integrate with the joint force. This is the old adage where quantity is its own kind of quality to some degree, and I think that's probably true. What I will say, though, is where we might need to grow in terms of new missions coming at the operational level, there's nobody questioning that if you get new missions, you have to grow to be able to perform those missions. I think the warning that General Raymond got was, don't bloat the staffs, because it's on the staffs where you slow things down. And if you have to coordinate with 60 different agencies, then you're going to just not put capability in the warfighter's hands as fast as possible. So I think we've been very judicious when it comes to adding people to staffs just for the sake of staff work. We have added people in a period of managed growth. We have added people to our operational force because we're getting new missions. We have new responsibilities for threat replication and test. And so I think we've done a good job of balancing where we add those people. We're going to have to fill out the service components because every combatant command needs access to space expertise. But these are more senior people. It'll take a while to grow that. And so we're going to be very deliberate with how we grow that. We're just not going to add unnecessary people to the staff. And just to put things in perspective, just because Space Command was established at the same time, and this is not about Space Command, honestly, that staff in Colorado is 6 times the size of the space staff in the Pentagon. 6 times the staff. General Whiting gave a briefing down in Orlando. The J2 organization is about the same size as the space staff. All right. Now, I'm not saying that's an imbalance. I'm just saying that's what's expected of joint integration. That's the kind of work capacity that's required. And your space staff is doing that well below what I think would be a traditional staffing level. And so far, so good. We're just going to have to monitor very closely.
I remember when we started out, I was the Air Force A3 back in 2015-ish timeframe. And I think if you look at the air staff at that time, and don't quote me on the numbers, this is a wag, there was probably less than 100 space experts across the staff, and that's probably being generous. I think it was significantly less. I became the service chief, and day one they said, sir, your staff is going to have 1,035 people in it. I said, 1,035 people? What are 1,035 people going to do? We only had 100 before. And so I know
what they would do, but
So I slashed it. We slashed it to 600. And then I quickly realized what a staff of 1,035 people do. They'd go to meetings.
Yeah.
And that's what the Pentagon does. And so you have to have enough bureaucracy, enough mass, if you will, to be able to operate inside the bureaucracy of the Department of Defense. But I agree with you. I would suggest there is clearly no kudzu on the Space Force staff. And I would say that you probably would be really difficult just to find a weed. I mean, it is really, really lean.
If I could put a fine point on that, it's not just going to the meetings. It's because we have service level responsibilities. It's elevating the discussion that makes sure that in those meetings, space is accounted for. That's the critical function that's played, whether it's a budget discussion, whether it's a requirements discussion. You know, and we've talked before that before we were a service, we weren't in those sessions. We weren't in those meetings at all. And so the important questions that needed to be asked went unasked. So that's what it means to be in the meetings. You're not there as a note taker. You're there to represent the equities of a warfighting domain and make sure that it's properly resourced. And this is a balancing act.
Yeah, and when we built the staff initially, as a member of the Joint Chiefs, you have to have a staff that can be able to support you in that role. You have to have, critical to that is something called an ops step. That can sit at the table with the other operational deputies of other services. That's why then Lieutenant General Saltzman was in that position to be the S3, to be able to have those conversations with the counterpart. If you look at, if you're going to have your own budget, you have to be able to sit across the table and have the same conversations on the budget. And that's why Lieutenant General Bill LaCourie was the force programmer, so they have the same seat at the table. So I wholeheartedly agree with you. Well, let's talk the budget. So in over the first 3 years, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have prioritized national security space. And the budget in the first 3 years doubled in the first 3 years, largely going to something that we'll talk about next, kind of a new force design, and making that pivot from old, large, exquisite to new, proliferated, less exquisite. I was a little concerned when I saw the budget last year that the increases kind of were flattened out. What is your, and I know what a critical time it is for the Space Force today as you make that shift in force design, as you do the work to develop the space professionals, the guardians. I've heard the Secretary of the Air Force talk about the need for growth in both people and dollars. What is your sense for how this is going inside the department in support for budget growth of the service and resources growth at large?
I think there's just some big questions that we should honestly make sure are out there in the narrative. And one of the things we hear routinely is how critical the space domain will be to all of our military objectives. So The Navy talks about how critical space superiority is in a Western Pacific fight. The Army understands the value of space capabilities as they try to protect maneuver in Europe, et cetera. So these are things that operationally we've declared are critical. The Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has said that space is likely the most critical domain in the future of warfare. And now you ask yourself, at 3% of the budget, are we properly resourcing something which is the most critical domain? Especially when we're talking about adding capability that's never there. You may have heard the analogy converting a merchant marine into a U.S. Navy, you know, a little bit about shifting from providing services in a benign environment to really being able to contest the domain effectively. But what I mention all the time is a modern merchant marine is still not a U.S. Navy. So when we talk about the growth of the Space Force early, it was largely about aggregation of mission sets. We brought satellite communications over, we brought all the missile warning capabilities over, Space Development Agency was absorbed in, and those looked like growth to the Space Force budget, but it was really an aggregation of resources. The initial work that when Secretary Kendall came in and did with his operational imperatives did put an infusion of investment in, but it was mostly about the resilient architectures. That was the early design work and the early money that we put against proliferated warfighting architectures. And now we're starting, you know, a couple of years later, we're starting to see that get on orbit. But it's this counterspace idea. It's the idea that we have to protect the joint force from an increasingly dangerous space-enabled targeting web that our adversaries are putting in place. That is a deficiency, and a flat budget doesn't give us the buying power to put those capabilities in place. And so I see that as one of the biggest challenges or opportunities, if you will, going forward, is when I'm not just asking for a top line that goes up because I think all budgets should go up. I'm asking for it because there's new mission associated with this counterspace capability that we need to invest in, and that's going to naturally be an increase in resources.
Great. You know, let me shift now to what I would consider probably the top 3 biggest benefits that we've achieved to date, having established a separate Space Force. The first few years was a lot more was done than just doing uniforms and flags and songs. I think one of the biggest things that we did was we focused on force design. And we stood up an organization called the Space Warfighting Analysis Center to do that force design work, largely mission area by mission area. Started out with missile warning, missile tracking. It's they did all the design work, pulled the department together to get agreement on this is the way we're going to build it, had Congress support it and put in legislation that you are now the lead for force design for the department. I know you're getting ready to, you've announced and you're establishing a Futures Command that'll take the Space Warfighting Analysis Center to even greater levels. Give me a sense for where that is, the establishment of that, and give us a sense for how the force design work is progressing. Because if you're gonna have an architecture that has, I'm making this up, 5 or 6 or 7 very expensive, very large, very exquisite satellites, you're not gonna do that fast.
Absolutely. And the power of what Jay's talking about in terms of the SWAC analysis, it gave us the data set that we could then use in the budget fights. Here's why we want this. Here's the analytical background that says why we need what we're asking for. And so I think it proved that if you could bring data to the budgeteers of the world, they had a harder time arguing with your logic. Makes perfect sense, but you got to do the hard work. You got to line up the PhDs. The physics of space can be a little bit out of sight, out of mind, right? And so we had to do that work. Futures Command is really just taking that and doubling down on it. It's one thing to buy satellites on orbit, and I think if Andrew Cox was sitting here, who did some of the early SWAC analysis, he would be the first to say, we were designing on-orbit architectures, but we weren't necessarily talking about the manpower requirements, the MILCON requirements, the SCIF requirements to support the mission area. And so all Futures is doing is we're taking the SWAC Center and we're adding 2 additional centers, one for concepts and technology to evaluate our operational concepts. How many people do we need to do this? What is our intent for accomplishing this mission? Think moving target indications, for example. Once we have that concept, then we war game it in a second center and really validate it, really tease it out and say, yes, this is how we want to present forces so that we have a complete capability to offer, not just an on-orbit capability that lacks the ground structures or that lacks the training infrastructure for the operators, the manpower requirements. And so what we're doing with Futures is establishing all of those processes so that by the time you define an objective force, it's all the things the service needs to invest in order to make sure we have capabilities on the other side. And so where we are on it is we've established a task force that's doing this mission analysis to figure out what the size of these organizations are, and we can start the planning process. I really hope to establish a command element, a headquarters with a commander, early next year. And I want to start, I told them I was going to task them by the summer. So whatever it takes to get up and running so that you can start accepting taskings, by next summer we're going to start asking you to do the work.
That's great. The other area that I think we've made great progress in is fostering international partnerships, either maturing those that existed or building new partnerships. You look at some of the early successes, putting and the partnerships are not just data sharing partnerships, but actually operating, training, and building capabilities together. So just a couple weeks ago, I was in Japan, was at a ribbon cutting where the hosted payload program, where we took a space situational awareness payload, put it on a Japanese QZSS GPS type of satellite, has been delivered and getting ready to launch. We partnered with Norway to put hosted payloads on Norwegian satellites, saved over $1 billion for our government, and would get us onto orbit 3 years faster or so than if you had to build your own satellites. I'm really happy to see Air Marshal Paul Godfrey here. Goddard's is a spectacular officer that we've worked closely with for years. I'm cheering from the sidelines as you continue to ramp up this international partnerships. Give us a sense for how those international partnerships are helping with your capability development thought process.
Yeah, the only real shift that's happened since our early days and early thinking is we're just trying to do it earlier in the process. Rather than say, okay, now we have a payload, is there anybody that wants to launch it? Or once we launch it, we say, is there anybody that wants to help us share data? You know, almost an after-the-fact planning process. We're trying to bring them early into the process, into the force design, and actually own the mission with us, and then figure out how we can either cost share, mission share, personnel exchange, what's the right construct so that we can really be allied by design. No matter how large the U.S. space budget is relative to other nations, we can't afford to buy everything that we know we need. That's true across the nations. But if we are smart about where our gap analysis is and where we can contribute, then collectively, because we know we're going to fight as a coalition, then we think we'll have the capacity and the capabilities necessary to really put a combined force on the field. And so that's the idea. What I realized is we got some blind spots. We think about things organically. We don't think about things in terms of partnerships and alliances and counting on others to deliver capabilities for us. And so the addition of Air Marshal Godfrey directly on the staff as an assistant chief of space operations is to make sure that in all these meetings we're going to in the Pentagon, there's somebody there raising their hand going, hey, this isn't really the way they're thinking about this in Europe, or this is not exactly the best way to leverage them, or they have more to offer in Norway than you're thinking about. It's just a different mindset and a perspective that's asking those fundamental questions early in the design. I just, earlier this week, I met with the French Admiral that's the new SAC-T commander, Supreme Allied Command Transformation down at Norfolk, a NATO command. And what was on his mind, the reason he wanted to talk to me is he thinks NATO is behind in space business, both in terms of capability and integrated operations. And they're thinking multi-domain operations, and they see space as one of the shortfalls. So trying to orchestrate an allied by design NATO structure and more broadly across the globe means you got to start early in the discussions, working group level. What do you have? What do you need? And that's what we're really trying to do is pull them in earlier into the process.
I think that's great. As I continue to have opportunities to engage with international partners in my retired life, I think there's a hunger for what does the Space Force need and kind of laying out that vision and that strategy and then having those early conversations. I really believe we can leverage allies and partners in a much greater way with this new force design, and it gets to the heart of integrated deterrence.
You know how we got so much power out of establishing the commercial integration cell out at the JSPOC at the time, meaning you take commercial partners and you embed them in your operations, and suddenly they're awake to the threats and they see what you're doing, they see the challenges on a day-to-day basis. I'm kind of applying that same model to Futures Command. Have a foreign presence there so that the allies are right there. They see the challenges with design. They put their requirements in. They account for it early in the futures concept design so that when it gets to requirements, it's already accounting for their perspectives.
And I'm going to ask one more question, and then if anybody from the audience has questions, please feel free to fire away. We've got a way to get those from you and ask them of our CSO. Force presentation. For the longest time, because we were part of the service, one of the things services do is they present forces to combatant commands. And historically, because space was part of the Air Force, the way we presented forces was through the Air Component Commander. In fact, when General Saltzman was just a couple years ago, had the opportunity to serve as the deputy CFAC in the Central Command AOR. But again, it was part of an Air Force construct. Once we established the Space Force, that having the Air Force and other service present our capabilities to combatant command just wasn't going to work because they didn't belong to the Air Force anymore. We didn't belong to the Air Force anymore. I know we've been planning this for a while. I've followed along, and you've gotten 3 stood up. I was in Japan a couple weeks ago and heard that you just stood up, I think a couple weeks ago, a subcomponent for the Indo-PACOM service component at Yokota in Japan. I know you've got one in Korea as well. Kind of give us a sense for how those are going. Are you learning anything from them? You mentioned in your talk that you're planning on getting the rest of those up by the end of the year. Give us a sense for how that will go as well.
Yep. You know, the key lesson that I learned was we were initially thinking about it in terms of force presentation. How do I present forces to a non-Space Command combatant commander? And if you don't have a component, it just complicates that issue. So that was kind of the initial thought, and this goes back to 2020 as we were having those discussions, and we focused on Indo-PACOM and EUCOM and CENTCOM, where the threats were. What I've learned, especially since the establishment of those big 3, is there's far more that a combatant command does, obviously. Security cooperation with allies and partners, day in and day out. Education and training opportunities, the battle drills in our C2 centers, it's all of those opportunities. And if you are present as a part of the battle rhythm, then you are integrated. If you are not a part of it, you are not integrated. It is as simple as that. And so right now, I see this in spades because I'm integrated into Indo-PACOM, EUCOM, and CENTCOM. I'm not in SOUTHCOM and NORTHCOM. And so we have to go to great lengths to make sure that those combatant commands are accounting for us because we're not there. So it's integration into planning. It's integration into requests for forces, for building what are the next investments and opportunities and activities that a combatant command will have. When they want to innovate, they reach out to the component commanders and say, what do you need that you don't have? If you don't have a component command there and a headquarters, you miss out on all those discussions. That's the big lesson. It is about C2 of forces when you present them, absolutely. But it's more than that. It's just the day-to-day integration with the combatant commands, and a lot of that is just about having expertise there to be involved.
Okay, we've got a couple minutes. If you don't mind, we're going to shift to some audience participation. One of the things that was in the law that was the birth certificate for the Space Force, it said, do a study on how best to integrate the total force. And we did that. We studied this for the first year, came up with what we called it one component at the time, where you'd integrate active and reserve components together. With a service the size of the Space Force, we thought it would give a lot more flexibility, allow folks to go to NASA, go work in commercial industry, come back. I'm really happy to hear that, after probably 3 years of vetting, Congress passed the Personnel Management Act. And so the question from the audience is, how is that progressing and what steps remain?
Did Kit Kelly ask that question?
She probably did.
Just she's So because we have great support on the Hill, because we have high quality people in our S1, I think the report card is it's going as well as you could manage. Here's the complication. We now have the authorities to manage a part-time force inside our single component. This is amazing. But as a single component, as a Space Force, I have no authorities to manage part-time people yet. I don't have the databases. I don't have the structures, the policy that has to be in place to say, well, how many days do you have to work in part-time? Is it a flex schedule or is it 2 weeks a year? We have to do all of the work now to actually operationalize the authorities we've been given. And one of the key things that I want to do is really harvest the talent and experience that's currently resident in the reserves, in the Guard maybe eventually, but certainly in the reserves now. And I can't ask them to volunteer to come over and then not take care of them. They don't understand the rules. They don't understand how we take care of them for retirement. They don't understand where the billets go or how we execute this. So that is now the heavy lift that our S1 team is going through, is figuring out what are all those administrative mechanisms that have to be put in place to make sure that we can effectively execute those authorities. Tremendously exciting, though, because it gives us so much latitude, so much career flexibility. And I think it's going to be both good for retention as well as maintaining that expertise, which can be in part-time, that specialized expertise that we might not otherwise get.
Yeah, I think it's hugely transformational, and I applaud the efforts of your team and the S1 staff specifically for getting across the finish line. I'll ask one last question because we're right at the end of our time. If you look at deterrence is denying benefits, opposing costs, and having the ability to communicate. You have those capabilities, which is critical to the mission of the Space Force. How must the Space Force strike the right balance in publicly discussing offensive capabilities and weighing classification concerns?
I always tackle this question in two ways. One is you can't deter with something the enemy doesn't know about. I mean, that's just, if you intend it to be a break glass in case of emergency, we need this for a war-winning capability and it's vulnerable so we don't want anybody to know, then that's fine. But if your intent is to maintain safe, stable, sustainable environment and you want to deter aggressive behavior, then it has to be known. It has to be out there. Nobody is afraid of costs that or denial of benefits that they can't see. So that's one, is we have to be very judicious about what is our intent with these capabilities. And then the second discussion I always have is weapon systems are not inherently offensive or defensive. We have to remember that mindset in the other domains. I ask you, is the F-35 an offensive weapon or a defensive weapon? Is an aircraft carrier an offensive weapon or a defensive weapon? Operations inherently have offensive or defensive characteristics. Operations have to be approved by the President and the Secretary of Defense. And my job is to make sure that we have the capabilities for full spectrum options so that the Secretary of Defense, so that the President have a range of options that gives them credibility to deter. And if you can't impose costs and deny benefits with this full range of capabilities, you're not going to be as deterrent as you otherwise would. And so think in terms of operations and making sure that we have a full spectrum of assets that allow those kinds of operations to occur, and then you are in a more deterrent posture. And that's how we're pursuing it.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks to everybody for coming and attending. I would just wrap up where I started, thanking all those in the room that had a role in establishing the Space Force, specifically Congressman Cooper, who's here, and Congressman Rogers. I hearkened back as I started to the speech that Congressman Rogers gave, and I agreed with every single thing he said except one. And that was, at the end, he said, we want to build a Space Force that's as good as the Air Force and as good as the Army and as good as the Navy. And oh, by the way, we want to build a Space Force as good as Alabama football. If you were to Google, I'd encourage you to do so. Football national champions 2017, Clemson would come up. So I think the thing that I would suggest to him is, why would we want to build a service that comes in second place? We want to build a service that's leading. And I will tell you, we were leading before we established the Space Force, and without hesitation, without any hesitation, we are better postured today to maintain that leadership, thanks to the work of so many that are in this room, and for the leadership of General Saltzman and for the others on the Space Force team that are here. So again, thanks for being here. Absolutely. And congratulations on turning 5.
We promised a fantastic morning. We're going to break here for 30 minutes for lunch. Lunch boxes are provided in the atrium and beverages. You're welcome to bring them back here. We will start promptly at 12:30. Come back and join us. We have a fantastic afternoon lined up. Thank you.